The cold air of the great hall cut against her skin like invisible blades. Emma felt her hands tremble as Richard Collins held her by the wrist, his thick fingers squeezing with unnecessary force. The Count smiled at the crowd of nobles, but his eyes held a coldness that made her want to disappear. "My future wife," he announced, raising her hand as if it were a conquered trophy. Emma's stomach churned. Every whisper, every curious glance from the guests was suffocating her. She tried to breathe slowly, but the air felt too thin, too heavy. 5 days. That was all that was left before her life became the property of a man who disgusted her. She searched desperately for Ethan in the crowd, but she couldn't find him. Of course he wouldn't be there. Low-ranking knights weren't invited to noble announcements. A sharp pang of pain shot through her chest. He didn't even know. He still believed they had time. "Lady Emma possesses all the qualities a man of my station requires," Richard continued, tightening his grip on her wrist. "A refined education, exemplary behavior, and a beauty that will honor our lineage." The words sounded like shackles being forged around her. Emma forced a smile that made the muscles in her face ache. She knew that any resistance would be seen as insolence, any protest as ingratitude. A servant had no voice to question the will of a count. But inside her heart was screaming Ethan's name. King Henry watched from his high-backed chair, his tired eyes scanning the hall. He seemed older each day, more distant, as if he carried an invisible weight that was slowly consuming him. Emma had always felt a strange familiarity when she looked at him, an inexplicable warmth she couldn't understand. Richard released her hand with a sharp tug. Satisfied with the effect he'd created, she hid her pain, discreetly massaging her bruised wrist. The murmurs of approval from the nobility echoed through the hall like a death sentence. "The ceremony will be next Sunday," the Count declared, addressing the king. "It will be a union that strengthens our loyalty to the throne." "It will strengthen your ambition," Emma thought bitterly. She had known Richard long enough to see past his syrupy words. He didn't want her for love. He wanted her for some reason she didn't fully grasp, something related to her mysterious upbringing, the way she spoke Latin, the books she read with an ease other servants couldn't comprehend when they could barely write their own names. Sometimes she wondered where those skills had come from. She had no clear memories of her childhood before the age of 12, only fragments. A sweet voice singing lullabies, gentle hands brushing her hair, the scent of roses in a garden that might never have existed. The wind rattled the high windows of the hall, making the candle flames dance. Emma closed her eyes for a moment, thinking of the cottage where Ethan cared for old Arthur. There, far from the predatory gazes and cruel ambitions, she could breathe. There she was, just Emma, not a prize to be won. A single tear escaped and slid down her cheek before she could stop it. Richard didn't notice. He was too busy accepting congratulations and planning alliances. To him, she was already his property. To the kingdom, she was just a servant girl who was far too lucky for her own good. But fate, as Emma would soon discover, held secrets deeper than anyone could imagine. And some truths, when they finally come to light, have the power to shake the very foundations of an entire kingdom. The morning mist still kissed the damp earth when Ethan Miller emerged from the stables of Highmere Castle. His footsteps echoed in the empty courtyard, breaking the silence that preceded the court's awakening. The young knight adjusted the wool cloak over his broad shoulders, feeling the chill seep through his leather armor. Even after years of cold dawns, his body still protested the harsh routine. Ethan had earned his title not by birthright, but through a combination of iron-willed determination and courage that had impressed even the most seasoned knights. His father had been a common soldier who died defending the king's lands, leaving behind only a small farm and the honored Miller family name. The young man had grown up knowing that every achievement would depend on his own merit, every promotion a result of blood and sweat spilled on the training grounds and the battlefield. But as he walked the familiar path leading to the forest, Ethan wasn't thinking of military glory or royal recognition. His thoughts invariably turned to Emma Thompson, the young servant with brown eyes who could brighten even the darkest days in the castle. He had met her by chance years ago, when he was just a squire helping in the stables. She would bring supplies for the stable hands, and between shy smiles and casual conversations, an affection was born that grew with each chance encounter. Emma was different from the other servants. She spoke with a natural grace that contrasted with her humble position. She knew her letters and numbers as if she were born to them, and she possessed an instinctive elegance that sometimes made him forget she served tables and washed clothes for a living. There was a mystery to her origins, She had arrived at the castle as a child with no known family and had been taken in by the head cook's kindness. The love he felt for her was both deep and dangerous. Dangerous because low-born knights did not court servants who caught the eye of noblemen, and Emma, unfortunately, had caught the wrong eye. Lord Richard Collins, an influential count and heir to vast estates, circled her like a patient predator. Ethan saw the way the man watched her during meals in the Great Hall, how he prolonged unnecessary conversations when she served wine at important gatherings. Richard was cunning enough to disguise his intentions as courtesy, but Ethan recognized the hunger in his eyes. It wasn't love, it was possession. Arthur's cottage appeared between the trees, small and welcoming, with smoke curling lazily from its stone chimney. The old man had lived there for more years than Ethan could remember, an enigmatic figure most considered just an eccentric hermit. But there was something in those weary eyes that hinted at untold stories, wisdom accumulated over decades of experiences that remained secret. Ethan had first knocked on his door 5 years ago, offering help after a storm had felled several trees around the property. Arthur had accepted with quiet gratitude, and since then the knight had returned regularly to chop wood, draw water from the well, and make necessary repairs. He never asked too many questions about the old man's past. He respected his privacy and found peace in the simple routine. He knocked on the wooden door 3 times, as he always did. Silence. He frowned and knocked again, harder this time. Arthur was usually awake before sunrise, brewing herbal tea and organizing his day. The prolonged silence sent a shiver of concern down Ethan's spine. "Arthur," he called, gently pushing the door, which gave way with a soft creak. The inside of the cottage was dim, with only a few rays of light filtering through the cracks in the windows. Ethan found the old man collapsed near the hearth, unconscious but still breathing. His skin was too pale, his lips slightly blue. The knight's heart raced as he knelt beside the frail body. "Arthur, can you hear me?" he murmured, gently feeling the old man's wrist. The pulse was weak but steady. Without hesitating, Ethan lifted the old man into his arms, surprised by how light he felt. Arthur had always been thin, but now it felt as if he were carrying only bones and determination. The knight ran back to the castle, ignoring the growing weight in his muscles and the burning in his lungs. The castle courtyard was already showing signs of life when he arrived. A few servants swept the flagstones, stable hands prepared the horses for the day, and the smell of fresh bread wafted from the kitchens. Ethan yelled for help, drawing curious and worried glances. "Get a healer," he ordered a page who ran toward him. "Quickly." Emma appeared as if she had materialized out of thin air, her brown hair still slightly messy from sleep, but her eyes wide awake. She wore the simple dress of the servants, yet she still managed to look more elegant than many of the court ladies. "What happened?" she asked, rushing over. "I found him passed out. I don't know how long he's been like this." Emma didn't hesitate. She knelt beside Arthur, as Ethan carefully laid him on the stone ground, checking his breathing and touching his forehead for a fever. Her hands were gentle but sure, moving with a knowledge that went beyond what one would expect from a common servant. "He's dehydrated," she diagnosed after a few moments, "and probably hasn't eaten properly in days. I'll get some water and something light for when he wakes." Ethan watched her run toward the kitchens, once again admiring her natural ability to take command in a crisis. Emma possessed a gentle authority that made people obey without question, as if she were born to lead. The healer arrived shortly after, a bald man with skillful hands who examined Arthur with professional efficiency. He confirmed Emma's diagnosis, severe dehydration and general weakness, but assured them there was no immediate danger to his life. "He needs rest, good food, and constant care for the next few days," the man declared. "It's best to bring him inside the castle, where he can be properly watched." Emma returned with a bowl of fresh water and small pieces of bread soaked in warm broth. She knelt again beside Arthur, who was slowly beginning to stir. When the old man opened his eyes and saw her face leaning over his, something extraordinary happened. Arthur stared at her with an intensity that made Ethan instinctively step back. It wasn't just recognition, it was shock, pain, hope, and fear, all mixed into an expression that revealed far more than the knight could comprehend. The old man tried to speak, but only a hoarse whisper escaped his parched throat. Emma helped him drink small sips of water, and Arthur never took his eyes off her face for a second. His trembling hands rose hesitantly, as if he wanted to touch her cheek to make sure she was real. "Rest now," Emma murmured in a soft voice. "You're safe." Arthur nodded slowly, but his eyes remained fixed on her as he was carried to a room in the servants' quarters. Ethan noticed how the old man's hands trembled, not just from weakness, but from something much deeper, something that looked suspiciously like recognition. That afternoon, when Arthur was stronger and had eaten properly, he asked to speak with Ethan in private. The night found him sitting on the edge of the narrow bed, still pale, but with his eyes shining with a fierce determination that didn't match his physical frailty. "I need to tell you something," Arthur said, his voice still weak but firm. "About the young woman who helped me today." Ethan felt his stomach clench. There was something in the old man's tone that foretold a revelation that would change everything. "Emma is special, anyone can see that," he replied carefully. Arthur shook his head, a sad smile curving his dry lips. "You have no idea how special she is, young knight, and I fear she is in far greater danger than you can imagine." Arthur's words echoed in Ethan's mind all night. He had lain awake on his narrow cot in the knight's quarters, replaying every word, every expression on the old man's face when he saw Emma. There was an urgency in those tired eyes, a weight that suggested secrets kept for far too long. When the first ray of sunlight pierced the small window of his room, Ethan was already dressed and ready. He needed to understand what Arthur knew about Emma, even if the truth turned out to be more dangerous than he could imagine. He found the old man sitting in the small inner garden of the castle, watching the morning movements of the servants with unusual attention. Arthur seemed stronger, his posture erect again, but there was a tension in his shoulders that hadn't been there before. "Did you sleep well?" Ethan asked, sitting on the stone bench beside him. "Sleep evades men with a heavy conscience," Arthur replied, without taking his eyes off the courtyard. "I spent the night thinking about how to tell truths that should have been revealed long ago." Ethan followed the old man's gaze and saw Emma crossing the courtyard with a basket of clean laundry. She walked with that natural grace that always impressed him, greeting other servants with genuine smiles. There was nothing in her appearance or demeanor to suggest anything other than an ordinary young woman trying to make an honest living. "What do you know about her?" the knight asked, keeping his voice low. Arthur sighed deeply as if about to lift an enormous weight. "Emma Thompson is not who she thinks she is. In fact, she isn't even Emma Thompson." Ethan's blood ran cold. "What are you talking about?" 22 years ago, Princess Margaret, King Henry's eldest daughter, fled the castle the night before her arranged marriage to the Duke of Bramford. She was in love with a court poet, a young man of humble origins who had nothing to offer but beautiful words and a sincere heart. Ethan felt as if the world had stopped spinning. Arthur continued, his voice gaining strength as the story unfolded. Margaret and her love fled to a distant village, where they lived as common peasants for nearly 2 years. She gave birth to a daughter, a beautiful child, with brown eyes and hair as golden as her paternal grandmother's. But their happiness was short-lived. A sickness swept through the region, taking both Margaret and her companion. The child survived only because I arrived in time. "You?" Ethan could barely utter the word. "I was a royal advisor back then, tasked with finding the runaway princess. When I found her, it was too late to save her, but there was still a chance to protect her daughter. I brought the child back, but not to the castle, to a loyal peasant family who raised her as their own until she was 12. Ethan looked again at Emma, who was now hanging clothes on a line near the kitchens. The revelation was rearranging everything he thought he knew about her, finally explaining her mysterious education, her natural elegance, the way she sometimes seemed to carry a dignity that transcended her station. "Why did you bring her to the castle?" he asked, though a part of him already knew the answer. "Because the family who raised her died in an accident, and she was left alone in the world. I couldn't let her wander the roads as an orphan. But I couldn't reveal her identity either. There were too many in the court who would benefit from the death of a potential heir." Arthur turned to face Ethan directly, his eyes blazing with a fierce intensity. "Emma is King Henry's granddaughter. She is of royal blood, and Lord Richard Collins is dangerously close to figuring that out." Ethan's world crumbled and rebuilt itself in a matter of seconds. Emma, his sweet Emma, was a princess's daughter, the king's granddaughter, an heir to the throne, and he, a knight with no significant titles, had fallen in love with royalty without even knowing it. "How can you be sure Richard suspects?" he managed to ask. "Because he's not a fool. He's been watching Emma for months, noticing her refined education, her naturally aristocratic manners. He's been asking discreet questions about her origins, investigating her arrival at the castle. If he discovers the truth first, he will marry her to secure his own rise to power." A dull rage grew in Ethan's chest. Richard didn't love Emma. He saw her only as a tool for his ambitions. But now, knowing the truth, The situation had become infinitely more complex and dangerous. "What do you want me to do?" he asked, though he knew his life had just become impossible. "Protect her, and when the time is right, help me reveal the truth to the king." "And then what?" The question came out more bitterly than Ethan intended. "Then she becomes a princess, and I go back to being just a knight who can't even look in her direction?" Arthur placed a trembling hand on the young man's shoulder. "True love always finds a way, Ethan. Perhaps not the way we expect, but it always finds a way." Before Ethan could reply, they heard approaching footsteps. Lord Richard Collins was walking toward them, his calculated smile already in place. He wore expensive clothes, his cloak embroidered with his family crest, and he carried the natural arrogance of someone born believing the world owed him reverence. "Sir Ethan," he greeted with false cordiality. "And good Arthur, I see you're recovering well." "Lord Collins," Ethan stood, giving the minimal bow required. Richard ignored the coldness in the knight's voice and turned to Arthur with renewed interest. "I must say, I'm impressed with the care young Emma showed you yesterday. She demonstrated a knowledge of healing that goes far beyond what one would expect from a common servant." Arthur kept his expression neutral, but Ethan noticed the tension in his shoulders. "The young woman is kind and intelligent," the old man replied carefully. "Kind and intelligent," Richard repeated, as if savoring the words. "And well-educated, I might add. Yesterday I heard her speaking Latin with the priest during Mass. Fluently. It's curious how an orphan with no known family acquires such skills." Ethan's heart pounded dangerously. Richard was fishing for information, testing their reactions, and from the gleam in his eyes, he already suspected far more than he was letting on. "Some people are born with natural gifts," Arthur said, his voice firm but cautious. "Natural gifts," Richard murmured, "or perhaps a very particular upbringing. I'm thinking of making Emma my wife, you know. A young woman with her qualities would be a valuable addition to my household." The words landed like stones in Ethan's stomach. He clenched his fists, fighting the urge to punch the arrogant smirk off Richard's face. "Has she given her consent?" he asked, keeping his voice controlled with superhuman effort. Richard laughed, a cold, calculated sound. "A servant's consent is a formality, Sir Ethan, especially when the marriage offers her a station far above her humble origins. And what if she doesn't want to?" Ethan knew he was treading on dangerous ground, but he couldn't stop himself. Richard's smile turned predatory. "Why would a servant refuse the chance to become a countess? Unless, of course, she has other aspirations. Perhaps someone has been giving her improper hopes." The Count's gaze met Ethan's with a clear challenge. He knew about the knight's feelings for Emma, and he was making it very clear that he considered any interference a betrayal. Arthur rose slowly, breaking the growing tension between the two men. "If you'll excuse me, I need to rest a bit more. Age takes its toll." Richard nodded, still watching Ethan with predatory attention. "Of course. Take care of yourself, Arthur. And Sir Ethan, I hope our conversation has clarified certain expectations." As Richard walked away, Arthur whispered quickly to Ethan, "We have less time than I thought. He already knows too much. He's just waiting for the right moment to act. We need to move quickly." Ethan watched Richard's figure disappear down the castle corridors, then turned his gaze back to Emma, who continued her chores, unaware that her entire life was about to change forever. The love he felt for her now carried the weight of a kingdom's destiny, and he had no idea how to protect her from what was coming. Emma noticed something had changed in the way Ethan looked at her. For the 3 days following Arthur's recovery, the knight seemed to carry an invisible weight on his shoulders, his eyes seeking hers with a new, almost desperate intensity. When they passed in the castle corridors, he would hesitate as if he wanted to say something important, but the words never came. She was hanging the last of the laundry on the line when she saw him approaching the inner garden. The afternoon sun gilded his dark hair, and even with his worried expression, he was still the most handsome man she had ever known. Not just for his looks, Ethan possessed a genuine kindness that radiated from his simplest gestures, an honor that showed in the way he treated even the humblest servants. "Emma," he called, checking to see if they were alone before coming closer. "Can I talk to you?" She wiped her hands on her apron and nodded, feeling her heart speed up as it always did when he was near. Ethan had a way of making her world seem brighter, more full of possibilities. "Of course. You've seemed worried these past few days." They moved to a more secluded area of the garden, where a small fountain murmured softly among budding rose bushes. Emma sat on the stone edge, noticing how Ethan's hands were trembling slightly. "There's something you need to know," he said, his deep voice thick with emotion. "About Lord Collins." The name fell between them like a cold shadow. Emma felt her stomach clench. In recent weeks, Richard had intensified his attentions in a way she could no longer ignore. Prolonged conversations during meals, expensive gifts that were inappropriate for her station, looks that made her feel like prey being watched by a predator. "What about him?" she asked, though she already feared the answer. "He intends to ask for your hand in marriage. Soon." The words hit Emma like a physical blow. She had suspected it, but hearing it confirmed made her vision blur for a moment. Her hands instinctively reached for Ethan's, clinging to them like an anchor. "I can't," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Ethan, I can't marry him." "Why not?" The question came out harsher than he intended. "He's a count, wealthy, influential. He offers a life that I could never—" "Because I don't love him," Emma interrupted, her words a desperate confession. "Because I love you." The silence that followed was charged with everything they had never said, with all the feelings they had carefully kept hidden. Ethan gently pulled her closer, his hands cupping her face with a tenderness that made her want to cry. "Emma," he murmured, as if speaking her name were a prayer. "You know I love you too, more than life itself." But you're a knight and I'm a servant," she finished, a tear tracing a path down her cheek, "and the world doesn't forgive this kind of love." Ethan kissed her then, gentle but desperate, as if he wanted to burn this moment into his memory forever. Emma responded with all the passion she had stored in her heart, knowing this might be the first and last time they could be like this, truly free. When they broke apart, they both knew something fundamental had changed between them. There was no going back. "There's more," Ethan said, his forehead resting against hers. "Arthur told me things about you, about your origins, things that could change everything." Before he could explain, they heard approaching footsteps. They quickly pulled apart, but not fast enough. Lord Richard Collins emerged from the rose bushes with a smile that didn't reach his cold eyes. "What a touching scene," he said, his voice dripping with venom disguised as civility. "Sir Ethan, must I remind you that excessive courtesy with the servants can be misinterpreted?" Ethan rose slowly, his hand instinctively resting on the hilt of his sword. "Lord Collins, I didn't see you coming." Evidently, Richard approached Emma, who had stood up and was trying to regain her composure. "Emma, my dear, I need to speak with you, alone." It wasn't a request, but a thinly veiled command. Emma looked at Ethan with poorly disguised desperation, but she knew she had no choice. Openly refusing a count would be social suicide. Ethan hesitated, every muscle tense, but finally nodded and stepped away, not before whispering, "I'll be close by." When they were alone, Richard circled Emma like a predator sizing up its prey. His presence radiated power and menace, making her feel small and vulnerable. "You're an intelligent young woman," he began, stopping far too close. "Too intelligent to waste your life on foolish fantasies." Emma lifted her chin, forcing herself to meet his eyes without showing fear. "I don't know what you're talking about, my lord." Richard let out a low, humorless laugh. "Of course you do. I see how you look at that knight, how he looks at you. It's pathetic, really. A man with no significant lands dreaming of things far beyond his reach." "Sir Ethan is an honorable man," she defended, feeling heat rise in her cheeks. "Honorable," Richard repeated with disdain. "And poor, and with no future. Do you have any idea how many servant girls waste their lives dreaming of knights who abandon them as soon as a better opportunity comes along?" Emma wanted to scream that Ethan wasn't like that he was different, but she knew any protest would only confirm Richard's suspicions. "I, on the other hand," the Count continued, stepping even closer, "offer something real, marriage, a title, a life of luxury and security that your mysterious origins deserve." The way he said mysterious origins made Emma's blood run cold. There was something in his tone that suggested dangerous knowledge. "What do you mean by that?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. Richard smiled, but his eyes remained as cold as ice. "A young woman with your refined education, your naturally aristocratic manners, your fluency in Latin. It's clear you're no ordinary servant. The question is, who are you really?" Emma felt as if the floor were crumbling beneath her feet. She had always known she was different from the other servants, but she had assumed it was just due to the years with the kind family that had raised her. She had never deeply questioned her unusual education or the strange fragments of memories that sometimes visited her in dreams. "I'm just Emma Thompson," she said, but her voice sounded less convincing than she intended. "I have my doubts about that." Richard leaned closer, his warm breath on her ear. "But don't worry, my dear. I don't care about your mysterious past. In fact, it makes you even more valuable." The word valuable sounded like a threat. Emma instinctively pulled back, but Richard grabbed her wrist with enough force to hurt. "You will marry me," he said, all pretense of courtesy gone, "and you will forget whatever foolish crush you have on that night. Because if you don't do it willingly, I will find other ways to persuade you." "Are you threatening me?" Emma tried to pull free, but his fingers tightened. "I'm being practical." Richard released her abruptly, causing her to stumble. "I have enough influence to destroy Ethan Miller's career with a single word in the right ear. I can have him sent on missions from which knights rarely return, or I can simply accuse him of improper behavior with a servant." Nausea rose in Emma's throat. She knew Richard's power. She knew he wasn't bluffing. "And if I accept?" she asked, hating herself for asking but needing to know. "If you accept, Ethan remains safe. He might even receive a promotion as a wedding gift, a demonstration of my generosity." It was a gilded cage, but a cage nonetheless. Emma looked at the surrounding rose bushes, thinking how quickly life could change. In the morning, her biggest problem was hiding her feelings for Ethan. Now she was being forced to choose between her own heart and the life of the man she loved. "I need time to think," she said finally. Richard smiled, satisfied with his apparent victory. "Of course, but not too much time. I will announce our engagement at the spring ball. That gives us exactly 1 week." He walked away with confident strides, leaving Emma alone among the roses that suddenly seemed to have lost all their beauty. She sank back onto the edge of the fountain, her hands shaking violently. 1 week, 7 days to find an impossible solution or see her life turn into a golden nightmare. It was then that Arthur appeared, moving silently from between the trees as if he had been waiting for Richard to leave. His tired eyes were full of compassion and determination. "I heard everything," he said softly, "and the time has come for you to know who you really are, my dear child." Emma looked up at him through her tears, feeling that the world was about to collapse completely. "Who am I, Arthur?" she whispered. "You are King Henry's granddaughter," he said simply, "and that changes absolutely everything." Arthur's words echoed in the air like silent thunder. Emma stared at him, trying to process what she had just heard, but the words seemed too slippery for her mind to grasp. That's impossible," she murmured, shaking her head. "You're still delirious from your illness." Arthur approached slowly, his eyes shining with a mixture of pain and relief. "I was there when your mother died, Emma. Princess Margaret, King Henry's eldest daughter. She fled her arranged marriage for true love, lived for 2 years as a peasant, and gave birth to a girl with brown eyes and hair that shone like gold in the sun." Emma felt the world spin around her. Fragments of memories began to connect. A sweet voice singing songs she now recognized as court lullabies, delicate hands teaching her to write letters that felt all too familiar, the scent of roses that sometimes visited her in dreams. "The woman who raised me was not your real mother, but she loved you as her own," Arthur finished gently. "When Margaret died, I brought you to a loyal family who promised to raise you in safety. But I always knew that one day the truth would have to come out." "Why now?" Emma managed to ask, her voice a rough whisper. "Because Lord Collins is dangerously close to discovering it on his own, and because," Arthur glanced toward the castle, "I believe the king is dying." The implications of those words hit Emma in successive waves of shock. If she was truly the king's granddaughter, if Henry was dying, if her identity were revealed, "I would become an heir," she said, the reality crashing down on her like an avalanche. "One of the heirs," Arthur confirmed, "and certainly the only one with direct royal blood." Emma shot to her feet, pacing in small circles, her hands shaking violently. "Does Richard know? Is that why he wants to marry me?" "He suspects. He's investigating, but he isn't certain yet." "And Ethan?" The question escaped before she could stop it. Arthur sighed deeply. "Ethan knows. I told him yesterday. The poor boy is as lost as you are." Emma stopped pacing and stared at the old man. "He knows that I might be a princess, and yet he still loves you." Arthur smiled sadly. "My dear, true love doesn't change because of a title. It may become more complicated, more difficult, but it doesn't disappear." Emma sat heavily on the edge of the fountain, feeling as if all the certainties of her life had been ripped away at once. "What should I do?" she asked, more to herself than to Arthur. "First, we need to gather the proof," he said, pulling a small scroll from his tunic. "I've kept documents, testimonies, even a letter from your mother written shortly before she died. Everything the king will need to confirm your identity." Emma took the scroll with trembling hands and unrolled it. It was a letter written in delicate, elegant script. "My dearest daughter, if you ever read these words, know that every moment I lived away from the court was worth it for the love I found and the life you represent. You carry royal blood in your veins, but more importantly, you carry kindness in your heart. Use both wisely. With all my love, Margaret." Tears streamed down Emma's face as she read. Suddenly, everything made sense. Her instinctive education, her natural posture, the way she sometimes felt out of place among the servants, as if she belonged to another world. "When should we tell the king?" she asked, carefully folding the letter. "Before Richard forces the marriage," Arthur said firmly. "But we must be strategic. The revelation of a lost heir could cause political instability. There are factions in the court that would benefit from chaos." They were interrupted by hurried footsteps. Ethan appeared from between the trees, his face tense with worry. "Emma, are you all right?" After Richard, he stopped abruptly when he saw the letter in her hands and the look on her face. "You told her. It was necessary," Arthur said, "especially after Collins's threats." Ethan approached slowly, his eyes seeking Emma's with hesitation. "How are you feeling?" he asked softly. "Confused, scared, lost." Emma stood, and without thinking of the consequences, walked toward him. "But you still look at me the same way." Ethan held out his hands, and she took them, lacing her fingers through his. "You're still the same Emma who won my heart years ago," he said. "A title doesn't change who you are in here." He gently touched her chest over her heart. "But it changes everything else," she said, her voice breaking. "If I'm really a princess, we can never—" "We don't know what's possible yet," Arthur interrupted, watching the interaction between them intently. "First, we must reveal the truth. Then, we will see what options remain." Suddenly, the sound of trumpets echoed through the castle, announcing the arrival of important visitors. The three of them turned toward the main gates, where a royal procession was entering the courtyard. "Prince Edward," Arthur murmured, recognizing the banners, "the king's youngest son. This complicates things." Emma felt a shiver of premonition. The arrival of a prince at the exact moment she discovered her own royal lineage couldn't be a coincidence. "Why would he be here?" Ethan asked. Arthur frowned thoughtfully. "Edward has always been ambitious. If the king is as ill as I suspect, he may be here to consolidate alliances." The implication hung in the air, heavy and threatening. If Edward discovered Emma before they could properly reveal her to the king, she could become a pawn in a game far more dangerous than a simple forced marriage. "We must act quickly," Arthur said, his voice filled with urgency. "Tonight, after the supper, when the prince is settled, we will take the proof to the king in his private chambers." Emma nodded, feeling the weight of destiny closing around her like a net. In a matter of hours, her life would change forever, for better or for worse. Ethan squeezed her hands one last time before letting go. "Whatever the outcome, we'll face it together," he promised. Emma looked at the man she loved, then at Arthur, who had kept her secrets for so long, and finally at the castle, where her life was about to be completely transformed. "Then let's begin," she said, surprised by the firmness in her own voice. The lost princess was about to come home. The great supper was held in a palpable tension. Emma served wine to the nobles with steady hands, but her heart was beating so loudly she was sure everyone could hear it. Prince Edward occupied the seat of honor to the king's right, his presence dominating the hall with a natural authority that made the other nobles bow their heads slightly in his direction. Edward was a man of about 30, with dark hair like his father's, but with eyes that glittered with an ambition Henry had never possessed. He watched everything around him with calculated attention, noticing every detail, every expression, every unspoken word. Emma forced herself to keep her eyes down as she approached to fill his cup, but she felt the weight of his gaze on her. When she raised her face slightly, she found him studying her with an intensity that made her tremble. "Are you new here?" Edward asked, his voice carrying a royal authority that did not permit being ignored. "No, Your Highness," Emma replied, curtsying. "I have served in the castle for many years. Curious, I have a good memory for faces, and I would certainly remember yours." Lord Collins, seated nearby, intervened with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Emma is one of our more refined servants, Your Highness. Perhaps that is the quality that makes her memorable." The prince nodded slowly, but his eyes remained fixed on Emma for longer than was appropriate. She moved away as soon as she could, feeling as if she had just escaped a predator. Across the hall, Ethan watched everything with a clenched jaw. He was stationed with the other knights, But Emma could feel his tension even from a distance. When their eyes met briefly, he gave an almost imperceptible nod, a silent reminder that he would be waiting for her later. King Henry seemed more frail than Emma remembered. His skin had a sickly pallor, and he ate little, preferring to observe the conversations around him with tired eyes. Several times during the supper, she saw him looking at her with a strange, almost melancholy expression, as if something in her face stirred distant memories. When the meal finally ended and the nobles retired to their chambers, Emma felt as if she had been holding her breath for hours. She found Arthur waiting in the shadows near the kitchens, a small leather pouch in his hands. "Are you ready?" he asked in a low voice. Emma nodded, though her stomach was twisting with nerves. What if he doesn't believe us? What if the proof isn't enough? For 22 years I have kept these documents waiting for this moment. Arthur opened the pouch slightly, revealing carefully preserved scrolls. They are genuine. The king will recognize them. Ethan appeared from the shadows, having already changed out of his armor into simpler clothes, to move unnoticed through the corridors. "The guards at the royal chambers are loyal to the king," he said. "If we request a private audience, they won't ask questions." The three of them moved carefully through the castle corridors, avoiding the main routes where they might encounter other nobles. Emma knew every passage, every secret staircase, every shortcut, knowledge that now made sense in a new way. Perhaps it was royal blood running through her veins that made her move through the castle so naturally. They reached the royal chambers without incident. The two guards at the door recognized Arthur and Ethan, nodding respectfully when Arthur asked to speak with the king on an urgent matter. "His Majesty is resting," one of them said hesitantly. "Perhaps in the morning." "It's about his daughter, Margaret," Arthur said simply. The words had the effect of a lightning strike. The guards exchanged a look, then one of them disappeared through the door. Moments later, he returned with instructions for them to enter. The king's chamber was vast but warmed by a large fireplace. Henry was sitting in an armchair near the fire, wearing a simple robe that made him look more like a tired grandfather than the sovereign of a kingdom. When he looked up to see who had arrived, his expression changed completely as his gaze fell upon Emma. "My God," he murmured, his voice barely audible. "Margaret." Tears welled in Emma's eyes. Even without confirmation, even without the proof yet presented, the recognition on the king's face was unmistakable. "Your Majesty." Arthur knelt, and Ethan immediately followed. Emma hesitated for a moment, then knelt as well. "Rise, my child," Henry said, his voice trembling. "Let me look at you properly." Emma stood slowly, feeling as if she were in a dream. The king rose too, approaching with uncertain steps until he was just a few feet away. "The eyes, the hair, the shape of your face," he murmured, reaching out a trembling hand to gently touch her cheek. "You look just like Margaret did at your age, just like my wife when I first met her." "Arthur says I am your granddaughter," Emma managed to say, her voice a whisper. "Arthur has always been the wisest of my advisors." Henry turned to the old man, who approached with the pouch of documents. "What proof have you brought?" The next few minutes passed in a haze of revelations. Arthur presented each document, each testimony, each piece of evidence he had guarded for over 2 decades. Margaret's letter, birth certificates, baptismal records, even a locket that had belonged to the lost princess. Everything confirmed Emma's identity. Henry held the locket in his hands, tears streaming freely down his aged face. "I gave this to Margaret on her 16th birthday," he said. "She was wearing it when she ran away. I thought I would never see it again." Emma looked at the small golden pendant, delicately engraved with the royal crest. Fragments of memories began to form, gentle hands placing the chain around her neck when she was very small, the feel of the warm metal against her skin. "I remember it," she said, astonished. "Or I think I do." "You have more memories of your mother than you realize," Arthur said gently. "They will return in time." The king looked at Emma for a long moment, then at Ethan, who had remained silent throughout the revelation. "And you, Sir Ethan, what is your role in this story?" Ethan swallowed hard before answering. "I love your granddaughter, Your Majesty, and she loves me." The brutal honesty of the declaration made Emma hold her breath. Henry studied the young knight's face intently. "A knight with no great titles in love with a lost princess," the king murmured. "What an interesting complication." "Your Majesty," Arthur intervened carefully, "there is another urgent matter. Lord Collins intends to force a marriage with Emma. He suspects her lineage and sees her as an opportunity for power." Henry's expression hardened instantly. "Collins has always been too ambitious for his own good. And my son, Edward. "He arrived today," Ethan said, "and he also noticed something special about Emma during the supper." Henry sighed deeply, suddenly seeming to carry the weight of the entire kingdom on his shoulders. "Then time has run out," he said. "Emma, my dear granddaughter, your life is about to change in ways you cannot imagine. The question is, are you ready to accept your destiny as a princess?" Emma looked at Ethan, then at Arthur, and finally at the grandfather she had just found. "I don't know if I'm ready," she said honestly, "but I know I can't run from who I am." Henry smiled for the first time since they had entered the room. "That is the answer of a true princess," he said. "Now we must decide how to protect you from the wolves who are already circling." Dawn brought with it an unusual stir in the castle. Emma had spent the night in the chambers reserved for the ladies of the court, a small but comfortable room that contrasted sharply with the servants' dormitory, where she had lived for years. She now wore a dark blue silk gown borrowed from one of the ladies, and her hair had been styled elegantly, revealing the natural nobility of her features. Looking at herself in the polished mirror, she barely recognized her own reflection. The transformation was astonishing, not just because of the rich clothes, but because of the way her posture had unconsciously changed, as if something dormant inside her had awakened overnight. The king had decided to reveal her identity during the morning council before Richard or Edward could make any damaging moves. But Emma knew there were enormous risks in that plan. The revelation of a lost heir could destabilize alliances, awaken dangerous ambitions, and even provoke armed conflict. A soft knock on the door pulled her from her thoughts. Arthur entered, wearing his finest court attire, a reminder of his days as a royal advisor. "How are you feeling, Your Highness?" he asked with a gentle smile. The title made her flinch. It was still hard to accept that in a matter of hours she had gone from servant to princess. "Scared," she admitted, "and worried about Ethan." "Where is he?" "Preparing for the council. The king has decided to appoint him as your temporary personal guard, a way to keep him close during the turbulence to come." Emma nodded, relieved to know Ethan would be nearby. His presence calmed her in a way nothing else could. "And the others? Richard? Prince Edward? Do they know yet?" "Not yet." Arthur moved to the window, watching the activity in the courtyard. "But Richard is restless. He asked several questions about your whereabouts last night. And Edward, well, Edward has dangerous instincts for political opportunities." Before Emma could reply, they heard loud voices from the corridor. The door burst open unceremoniously, and Lord Collins stormed in. "Where was she all night?" he demanded, his eyes blazing with barely contained rage. "Emma disappeared from her quarters. No one saw her." He stopped abruptly as he saw Emma dressed as a lady of the court, her appearance so dramatically transformed that for a moment he didn't recognize her. What is the meaning of this?" he stammered, looking between Emma and Arthur. Arthur smiled serenely. "It means, Lord Collins, that your suspicions were correct. Emma is no ordinary servant." The realization hit Richard like a bolt of lightning. His pupils dilated as he processed the implications, and Emma saw the exact moment ambition replaced confusion in his expression. "Royal blood," he muttered, more to himself. "I knew there was something." "Knew what?" Prince Edward's voice echoed from the doorway. He entered with royal authority, having overheard part of the conversation. His gaze swept over Emma, taking in her transformation with predatory interest. "Your Highness," Arthur said with a respectful bow, "I believe it would be more appropriate if this conversation continued in the king's presence." Edward ignored the suggestion, approaching Emma with deliberate steps. "You're the servant girl from yesterday," he said, circling her like a hunter sizing up his prey. "But today you look very different." Emma lifted her chin, forcing herself to meet his eyes without showing fear. Something inside her, perhaps an ancestral instinct, prevented her from cowering before his intimidation. "I am the same person, Your Highness, merely dressed appropriately for my true station." The bold reply made Edward's eyes gleam with renewed interest. "True station? And what station would that be?" "Princess Emma of Hymir," Arthur said firmly. "Legitimate granddaughter of His Majesty, daughter of the late Princess Margaret." The silence that followed was as heavy as molten lead. Richard turned pale, then flushed, his hands trembling with rage and frustrated ambition. Edward, on the other hand, smiled, a cold smile that promised nothing good. "A lost princess," he murmured. "What a convenient discovery." "The proof is irrefutable," Arthur said. "Documents, testimonies, official records." "Documents can be forged," Edward interrupted. "Witnesses can be bought." Not by me. King Henry's voice boomed from the doorway. He entered, leaning on his cane, but his presence still commanded absolute respect. I am the one who attests to the legitimacy of my granddaughter. Edward bowed respectfully, but Emma saw the tension in his shoulders. Father, surely you understand the complications such a revelation could cause. I understand perfectly, Henry said, moving to Emma's side and placing a protective hand on her shoulder. And I also understand the need to protect my family from opportunists. The king's gaze swept over Richard and Edward with clear disapproval. Lord Collins, Henry continued, I believe your plans to marry my granddaughter are cancelled. Richard stepped forward, his face contorted with frustration. Your Majesty, I offered protection and a position to a nameless orphan. Now I discover she is a princess, and my proposal becomes even more advantageous for the kingdom. Your proposal becomes irrelevant, Henry cut in coldly. Emma is no longer a young woman without choices. She is a princess, and she will marry according to her own will and the interests of the kingdom. Edward smiled again, and Emma felt a shiver of premonition. The interests of the kingdom, the prince repeated. I agree completely, father. A princess of such importance must make a powerful alliance. Perhaps a marriage to her own cousin, uniting the two strongest claims to the throne? The suggestion hung in the air, a blatant power grab. Before anyone could react, the Chamberlain announced a new arrival. His Grace, the Duke of Bramford. Emma's blood ran cold. Bramford was the man her mother had fled from, a powerful, ruthless duke known for his ambition. His arrival at this exact moment could not be a coincidence. The Duke entered, a man in his late 50s with eyes as hard as flint. He bowed to the king, but his gaze was fixed on Emma. Your Majesty, he said, his voice a low rumble. I have come to collect on an old debt. I believe you owe me a bride. The great hall had never felt as tense as it did that afternoon. The Duke of Bramford had arrived with an escort of 50 armed knights, a show of force that bordered on provocation. The man himself was imposing, tall, with greying hair and broad shoulders that still carried the authority of decades on the battlefield. His eyes, however, were what was most striking, as cold and calculating as a seasoned predator's. Emma sat at the king's right hand, now wearing a purple gown that made her royal station clear. The crown jewels, an emerald necklace that had belonged to her mother, gleamed around her neck like a silent declaration of legitimacy. But her hands trembled slightly, hidden in the folds of her skirt. Ethan was positioned behind the king's throne, wearing the full armor of the royal guard. His presence was a constant comfort, but Emma knew he was in a vulnerable position. One wrong move, one misplaced word, and his life could be in danger. Bramford approached the throne with measured steps, offering only the minimal bow required by protocol. Your Majesty, he said, his voice echoing through the silent hall. I must confess my surprise at discovering my lost bride left behind an heir. The reference to Princess Margaret as his lost bride made Emma clench her fists. The man spoke as if her mother were property that had been stolen from him. Princess Margaret made her own choices, Henry replied coldly, and her daughter is not responsible for decisions made decades ago. Bramford smiled, but there was no warmth in his expression. Of course, but I must note that our arranged union still has interesting legal implications. If Margaret was my promised bride, her daughter could be considered appropriate compensation for breach of contract. Nausea rose in Emma's throat. The Duke was talking about her as if she were livestock to be traded. My granddaughter is not compensation for anything, Henry said, his voice carrying the authority of a lifetime of rule. Ah, but it's more complicated than that. Bramford moved closer to the throne, his eyes fixed on Emma. You see, I have documents proving the king promised substantial lands as Margaret's dowry, lands I never received due to her romantic flight. Arthur stepped forward from the group of advisors. What documents? Bramford gestured, and one of his men approached with a sealed scroll. The original marriage contract, signed by King Henry himself, promising the hand of Margaret and the lands of Westmarch as her dowry. Emma saw the colour drain from the king's face. Westmarch was one of the wealthiest regions in the kingdom, and losing it would be a devastating blow. These documents are over 20 years old, Arthur protested after examining the scroll. But they are valid, Bramford countered, and now that Margaret's line has been restored through her daughter, the contract can be honoured. Edward, who had remained silent, stepped forward. And what if Emma is already promised? He asked, casting a meaningful glance at Emma. Emma felt as if she were being surrounded by wolves. Bramford, Edward, Even Richard watched her with predatory interest, each seeing her as a tool for their own goals. "I am promised to no one," she said, her voice sounding stronger than she felt. "Not yet," Edward murmured, causing Ethan to tense visibly. Bramford studied the interaction between them with sharp attention. "I see there is competition for the princess's hand," he said with cruel amusement. "Perhaps we should settle this in a civilized manner. What do you propose?" Henry asked cautiously. "A tournament," Bramford declared. "Let each suitor prove his worth in combat. The winner will have the right to court her properly." The hall erupted in murmurs. The idea of a tournament for a princess was romantic in theory, but Emma knew that in practice it would just be another way for men to decide her fate without consulting her. "And if I refuse all suitors?" she asked, rising abruptly. The ensuing silence was tense. Bramford smiled, but his eyes narrowed dangerously. "A princess does not have the luxury of refusing advantageous marriages for the kingdom," he said. "Especially when there are debts to be paid." Emma felt the trap closing around her. No matter how much she protested or resisted, powerful men would always find ways to force her obedience. It was then that a clear voice cut through the tension. "I accept the challenge." Everyone turned to see Ethan step forward, removing his royal guard helmet. His dark hair was disheveled, but his eyes shone with iron determination. "Sir Ethan," Henry said, clearly alarmed, "you have no standing to—" "I have the right of a man who loves a woman to defend her honor," Ethan interrupted, looking directly at Emma. "If other men wish to decide her fate through force, then let them face someone willing to die for her." Tears welled in Emma's eyes. Ethan knew he was at a disadvantage, a knight of humble origins against wealthy, well-equipped nobles, but he was still willing to fight for her. Bramford laughed, genuinely amused. "A landless knight challenging dukes and princes. What a touching romance." "Do you accept the challenge?" Ethan asked coldly. "I accept." Bramford smiled like a hungry wolf, "just as I'm sure Prince Edward and Lord Collins will also accept." Edward nodded arrogantly, clearly confident in his skills. Richard hesitated but finally agreed. To back down now would be to publicly admit cowardice. Henry rose slowly from his throne, looking as if he had aged years in minutes. "So be it," he said with resignation. "The tournament will take place tomorrow at noon. The winner will have the right to ask for Emma's hand in marriage. And she will not be able to refuse," Bramford added quickly. Emma wanted to scream, to protest that her life was not a prize to be won in combat. But she looked at Ethan, saw the determination in his eyes, and understood that he was giving them the only chance they had. If he won, they would be free to marry. If he lost, she didn't want to think about what would happen if he lost. That night Emma managed to meet Ethan in the castle gardens, far from prying eyes. He was sitting by the same fountain where they had confessed their love, polishing his sword with methodical movements. "You're insane," she said, sitting beside him. "Bramford is one of the best swordsmen in the kingdom. Edward has trained with the finest masters. Richard may not be skilled, but he has expensive armor and superior weapons." Ethan stopped polishing his sword and looked at her with a sad smile. "Maybe, but it's the only chance we have to be together." "And what if you die?" The question came out as a broken whisper. Ethan pulled her closer, wrapping her in his arms. "If I die, at least I'll die knowing I fought for you, that I didn't surrender without trying." Emma buried her face in his chest, breathing in his scent, trying to memorize every detail of that moment. "There's something you need to know," she said. "If you lose, I will run. I will not marry any of them." Ethan gently pushed her back to look into her eyes. "Emma, if you run, you'll be hunted for the rest of your life. You'll have no peace, no safety." "I don't care," she interrupted. "I would rather live a life on the run with my freedom than a life in a gilded cage." They kissed then, long and desperately, as if to sear the moment into eternity. They both knew that the dawn could bring an end to everything they shared, but for that one night, under the stars and among the roses, they were just two young people in love, facing a world that insisted on tearing them apart. The tournament would decide if love could triumph over power, or if Emma would be forced to become another princess, sacrificed on the altar of politics. The noon sun beat down relentlessly on the makeshift arena in the castle courtyard. Emma sat in the royal box, dressed in a dark green velvet gown that contrasted with her pale skin. Her hands were clasped in her lap to hide their trembling, but her eyes never left Ethan as he prepared for what could be the last fight of his life. The tournament format had been decided the night before, single combat, one-on-one, until only one man remained. Bramford, as the original challenger, had the privilege of choosing his opponents. and naturally he had chosen to face Ethan last. After the knight was potentially wounded from previous fights, Richard would be Ethan's first opponent. The Count wore gleaming, obviously expensive armor, but Emma could see the nervousness in his movements. He was a politician, not a warrior, and he was clearly regretting having accepted the challenge. "Let the contest begin," King Henry announced, his voice echoing across the packed courtyard. Ethan and Richard took their positions in the center of the arena, swords raised. Emma held her breath as the two men began to circle each other, testing defenses and looking for openings. Richard attacked first, a clumsy blow that Ethan easily parried. The difference in skill was obvious from the first few seconds. Where Richard was hesitant and predictable, Ethan moved with the fluid grace of someone born to the sword. The fight lasted less than 5 minutes. Ethan disarmed Richard with an elegant move that drew cheers from the crowd, then placed the tip of his sword against the Count's chest. "I yield," Richard said quickly, relieved to be alive. One opponent down, 2 to go. Edward descended into the arena next, and Emma felt her stomach tighten. The prince was different from Richard. He moved with genuine confidence. His weapons were of superior quality, and he had years of training with the best masters in the kingdom. "I hope you saved some energy," Edward said with a cruel smile as he took his fighting stance. Ethan didn't reply, simply raised his sword and waited. This fight was much more evenly matched. Edward was skilled and relentless, his strikes precise and well-planned. Ethan was forced to retreat several times, dodging by inches from attacks that could have been fatal. Emma watched with her heart in her throat, every clash of steel on steel reverberating through her chest. When Edward managed a shallow cut on Ethan's arm, she had to force herself to remain seated. But Ethan had something Edward lacked. He was fighting for true love, not political ambition. That difference became clear when Edward, in a moment of arrogance, slightly lowered his guard to taunt one of Ethan's defenses. It was the mistake the knight had been waiting for. Ethan counterattacked with a devastating sequence of blows, forcing Edward to backpedal desperately. The final blow came when Ethan feinted high, then delivered a low sweep that knocked the prince off his feet. Edward fell heavily, his sword flying from his grasp. Ethan placed the tip of his blade at the prince's throat. "I yield," Edward said through gritted teeth, hatred shining in his eyes. 2 opponents down, 1 to go. Bramford descended into the arena slowly, like a confident predator approaching a wounded animal. It was clear Ethan was tired. Sweat poured down his face, his breathing was heavy, and the cut on his arm was bleeding through his armor. "You fought well," Bramford said with false respect, "but we have reached the end of your journey." Emma wanted to scream at Ethan that he didn't have to continue, that they could run away, that they would find another way, but she knew he would never back down. It was a matter of honor now, not just for her, but for everything he believed in. The final combat began with Bramford testing Ethan's defenses, looking for signs of weakness or fatigue. The Duke was too experienced to underestimate an opponent, even an injured one. For long minutes they studied each other, exchanging cautious blows. Bramford tried to use his experience to prolong the fight, knowing that time favored the rested man over the exhausted one. The strategy was working. Emma could see Ethan slowing down, his parries becoming less precise. When Bramford landed a blow that nearly pierced the armor on Ethan's chest, she couldn't suppress a cry of anguish. It was then that something unexpected happened. Arthur, who was in the crowd, shouted something that made Emma turn. "The sword, Ethan! Remember the sword!" Emma didn't understand at first, but she saw confusion on Bramford's face as well. Ethan, however, seemed to get it. His eyes lit up with new determination, and he glanced quickly at Emma. "This one's for you," he said, loud enough for her to hear. What happened next was almost miraculous. Ethan began to fight not just with skill, but with a fierce passion that transformed his every move. It was as if the love he felt for Emma had physically manifested through his sword. Bramford, caught off guard by his opponent's renewed energy, began to back away. For the first time in the fight, he was the one being pressed. The fight intensified into something almost like a dance, 2 master swordsmen giving their all in a battle that would decide the fate of a kingdom. The crowd watched in absolute silence, mesmerized by the deadly beauty of the duel. The end came when Bramford, attempting a desperate lunge, left himself exposed for a fraction of a second. Ethan didn't waste the opportunity. His sword found a joint in the Duke's armor, piercing deep into his shoulder. Bramford fell to his knees, his sword slipping from his numb fingers. "I yield," he said through clenched teeth, more from pain than defeat. The silence that followed was deafening. Then, slowly, the crowd erupted in applause that echoed throughout the entire castle. Emma ran from the royal box, completely forgetting royal protocol. She flew across the arena and threw herself into Ethan's arms, and he lifted her off the ground, despite his exhaustion. "You won," she whispered against his ear. "You actually won." "We won," he corrected, kissing her deeply in front of everyone. King Henry approached slowly, his face a mixture of pride and resignation. "Sir Ethan Miller," he said formally, "by right of conquest in fair combat, I grant you the privilege of asking for my granddaughter's hand in marriage." Ethan knelt before Emma, still holding his bloodied sword, but with his eyes shining with pure love. "Princess Emma," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "will you marry me? I cannot offer you riches or grand titles, but I can promise you my true love for the rest of our lives." "Yes," she answered without hesitation. 1,000 times yes. As they kissed again, sealing their fate before the entire kingdom, Emma knew that sometimes love really could triumph over power. 6 months later, in the small castle chapel decorated with white roses, Emma Thompson married Sir Ethan Miller in a ceremony that would become legend. The king, keeping his promise, granted Ethan substantial lands and the title of count, making him worthy of his station as a princess's husband. Bramford returned to his lands, his ambitions thwarted but his honor intact. Edward was forced to accept defeat, though he harbored resentment. Richard simply vanished from court, seeking opportunities in other kingdoms. Arthur lived long enough to see Emma happy, then passed away peacefully in his sleep, knowing he had fulfilled his final promise to Princess Margaret. And Emma, now Countess Miller but forever a royal princess, discovered that true love was indeed more powerful than any title or position, because it was the one thing in the world that could not be bought, forced or won through political schemes. It could only be given freely, received gratefully, and protected bravely. In the end, that was what she and Ethan did. They protected their love with enough courage to change the destiny of an entire kingdom. End of story. If you were moved by this epic journey of love and courage, don't forget to subscribe for more stories that touch the heart. Hit that like button if you were rooting for Emma and Ethan, and let me know in the comments. Did you believe their love could overcome all obstacles? What moment in this royal saga stood out to you the most? Your engagement fuels my passion for creating these stories that make us believe that, even in the toughest times, true love always finds a way.